It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Steve Wharton, the Royal Literary and Scientific Institution here in Bath. He is an Associate Professor of French and Communication in the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies at the University of Bath. His work at the University of Bath began in 1990. His research interests include political communication, the German occupation of France and its legacy, LGBT activism, including perceptions and portrayals of gay life and the gay marriage debate, and the meaning of literary romanticism. He studied French and German at Aston University. He also earned his PhD from Aston. His primary school education was at Wimborne St Giles, followed by Cranbourne Middle School and Queen Elizabeth School, Wimborne Minster. He has held various leadership positions in academic organisations, including the Association for the Study of Modern and Contemporary France and the University and College Union. He has also held trustee positions at institutions such as the University Superannuation Scheme, the Reform Club Conservation Charitable Trust, the Reform Club itself, and an education support partnership, and also Badminton School. However, he is also a trustee at our beloved Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. As Jean Giono once said, if I was going to draw Paris, I would draw myself. If I was going to draw Brilsey, I would draw Steve, because I associate him as, actually I would say he is coterminous with my own involvement there. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He is the author of Screening Reality, French documentary film during the French occupation. Dr. Wharton has been recognised for his contributions to French culture, being appointed as a Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques by the French government, and has also done work on the link between Aix-en-Provence and Bath. He has also contributed to various academic publications and online platforms. Tonight, he will talk about the person and the poetry of Thomas Hood. And as I shall not steal his fire, I leave it for him to introduce this fascinating poet, but to say that in his hands, the poet's words will come alive. Dr. Steve Wharton.
Well, thank you, Duncan, for that very generous introduction. And I shall be in touch with you about a publicity contract in due course. But I shall endeavour to do justice to what you have said. I'm just going to minimize to give as much screen as possible. Well, thank you, everybody, both online and in the room, for coming along this evening. The Women's Institute is next door talking about financial advice. I'm glad to see that I'm a better draw than that in terms of your being in this room rather than that room. Yes, the title of my talk this evening is Thomas Hood, Poet, Comic, Commentator, and I'm essentially going to cover those three particular aspects in three sections of my talk. As you may have seen for the publicity for this, my interest in Hood began at a rather early age when I read a poem on body snatching that Hood had written. It appealed to me then, and it was then some years later that I found even more interest in the man, and some of that I hope will be on display today. So what you're going to get this evening is a mixture of biography, poetry, and Hood's social commentary. So I'm going to try and weave those things together, but they will essentially focus on those three areas. So let us begin with the man himself, Thomas Hood. If somebody writing about him some 13 years after his passing said, I quote, "In outward appearance, Hood conveyed the idea of a clergyman. His figure slight and invariably dressed in black, his face pallid, his complexion delicate and features regular, his countenance bespeaking sympathy by its sweet expression of melancholy and suffering." Now, the melancholy is in part explained by some of the things that happened to him in his life, on which I shall touch. And his suffering was predominantly physical. He had quite a debilitating disease. It may well have been tuberculosis, but we will touch on that as well later. He has been more recently evaluated by Dr. Sarah Lodge of the University of St Andrews in her book on Thomas Hood and 19th century poetry. And this is part of his fascination for me. Editor, illustrator, dramatist, travel writer, journalist, novelist, humorist, and poet, Hood does not fit neatly into the divisions of genre and period that tends to shape university courses and their attendant course readers. And I think this is also part of the reason why you may know Hood without knowing that you know Hood, because he knew Lamb, he knew the Lambs, he was familiar with the work of Keats. He was, like Keats, one of the Cockney school. And yet he didn't fit neatly into those particular boxes because of his eclecticism and indeed his career path, and nor did he attend university. So but that's part of his fascination, this multifaceted individual that I will hope to illustrate. And we start, as all good discussions of somebody must begin, with a few aspects of their biography. You may notice the I remember from one of his poems. Born on the 23rd of May, 1799 at 31 Poultry in London, not the magnificent building we now see in this illustration, but a more humble building. His father was a bookseller. The Hood family was originally from Errol near Dundee and by tradition had been farmers, but his father was in London, and was said to be one of the first people to open a book trade with America, having success with new editions of old books. So there's a kind of literary vein running through what Hood does. And I think in his own literary reminiscences, this description is a wonderful thing. Next to being a citizen of the world, it must be the best thing to be born a citizen of the world's greatest city. It's a sort of theme and variation on what Dr. Johnson said about a man being tired of London and tired of life. His father died in 1811 and the family moved to Islington. He had a very supportive teacher, and as he says in his own biography, under the care of this decayed dominie, he earned a few guineas, his first fee, by revising for the press a new edition of the 1788 novel Paul and Virginia, drawing on the French work Paul et Virginie. He left school at 14, worked in the counting house of a family friend, where, as he says himself, he turned his stool into a Pegasus on 3 legs, every foot, of course, being a dactyl or a spondy. These kinds of sentences give us an indication of the fascination that he has with words and wordplay and poetry, which we see throughout his work. His poor health, even at that early age, led to a change of job, and so he turned to engraving, whether or not partly because of the chemicals that involved, his health was still an issue. So he was actually sent back up to Dundee, and then first to a maternal aunt, apparently fell out with her, and then boarded with one of her friends, a Mrs. Butterworth, who provided him with board and lodging. His first apparent literary output was a letter to the Dundee Advertiser concerning the sinking of a ship in the River Tay in 1815. It's been a little difficult locating that actual letter, but it is generally acknowledged as being some of his first output. But then in 1816 is when his poetic output really begins, when he publishes a narrative poem in the rather interesting mixture of the style of Walter Scott and Byron, the two great writers of the age, and then comes back to London in 1817, still intending to follow engraving as a profession. But after a few years, he switches from engraving to publishing. And by 1821, he was assisting the editor of the London magazine, as he described it himself, a sort of sub-editor. And it's at this point in engaging with correspondence that we begin to see the delight that he has in wordplay. And I'd just like to read out now these particular responses. So, first one. Somebody called W sends in a poem and is informed that his night is too long, for the moon rises twice in it. The essay on agricultural distress would only increase it. B is surely humming. HB's sonnet to the rising sun is surely written for a lark. W's tears of sensibility had better be dropped. The echo, we fear, will not answer. T says his tales are out of his own head. Is he a tadpole? And then finally, M's ode on the martyrs who were burnt in the reign of Queen Mary is original, but wants fire. So you can see the kind of thing that this whole issue of wordplay is such a part of his work. And to turn to what Sarah Lodge says again, and I think it's worth dwelling on it a little, like the duck rabbit famous in psychology, puns disconcert by drawing attention to the process of reading and the potential coexistence of incompatible readings. They delay arrival at the sentence's end and disrupt linear models of readings end. In Hood's writing, they are an engine of mobility, as we shall see, generating energetic verbal fusions and fissions, mirrored in the physical metamorphoses and dismemberments, exchanges and reforms that proliferate in his subject matter. Hood was fully aware that his puns were critical irritants. His persistent allegiance to this trope, above all others, is significant. The teasing verbal mobility that puns effect between high and low, concrete and abstract, subject and object has levelling social implications. Pitting the robust punning inheritance of Swift against the literary snobbery of Johnson, Hood deliberately chooses to ally himself with a tradition of literary humour that is suspicious of genteel sublimation and linguistic regulation. Punning also vividly expresses the values of pluralism, tolerance and recreative leisure that are central to Hood's political vision. The endlessly recombinant energies of the pun embody the free play of a populace that cannot forcibly be contained in any church, nor deterred from reproduction by Malthusian admonitions. In other words, he's having a laugh. He uses the language to make us reflect. We laugh at what he says, but in that well-known definition of comedy being a mousetrap into which people will always fall, you laugh, but then you realize there's something more serious behind it. And that is the brilliance of Hood's work in what he does. So he starts this literary career in 1821, but sadly, he is struck by another event, which is the death of his mother in July. In consequence of which he wrote this poem, The Deathbed, which I would just like to read. We watched her breathing through the night, her breathing soft and low, as in her breast the wave of life kept heaving to and fro. So silently we seemed to speak, so slowly moved about, as we had lent her half our powers to eke her living out. Our very hopes belied our fears our hopes belied. We thought her dying when she slept, and sleeping when she died. For when the morn came, dim and sad, and chill with early showers, her quiet eyelids closed. She had another morn than ours. 4 verses, full again of this contradiction, the dying when sleeping and sleeping when dead. But again, the power of those last 2 lines, I think, show not only his skill as a poet, but clearly the impact of his mother's death. However, life carries on, as did his work. And as we've seen, he worked with the London Magazine, and while he was there, he met the big names of the time, to a certain extent: Charles Lamb, John Hamilton Reynolds, Thomas de Quincey, William Hazlitt, William Wordsworth. He corresponded with Dickens. So he's a very well-connected individual in terms of what he does. But he severs his connection with the London Magazine in 1823 and turns to his own outputs, saying, as indeed he does in his own words, he needed to be a livelihood to earn a livelihood. Again, you know, even in his own personal conditions, he can't help playing with words. And 2 years later, in 1825, not only did he, together with John Hamilton Reynolds, publish an interesting series of poems called Odes and Addresses to Great People, and they include Grimaldi and Walter Scott and the like. But also on the 5th of May, he married Reynolds' sister, Jane, at St. Botolph's in Aldersgate. And he goes off on honeymoon, and even when he's on honeymoon and corresponding with his new sisters-in-law, he cannot resist playing with words. My dear Marianne, my dear Lot, Charlotte, I shall leave Jane to explain to you why we've not written sooner, and betake myself at once to fill up my share of the letter. Jane, meanwhile, resting her 2 sprained ankles, worn out with walking, or rolling rather on the pebbly beach, for she is not, as she says, the shingle woman that she used to be. In coming home, I killed a viper in our serpentine path. They are called adders, tell your father, because 2 and 2 of them together make 4. You can see there's this constant desire to be humorous and to make light. So there he is. His mother has died. 4 years later, he's married. What was this relationship with the formerly shingle woman? There's a wonderful quote by Gerald. Never was happier couple than the Hoods. Mutual reliance and fond faith seemed to be their motto. And that is very much the case, that they supported each other and through thick and thin. In 1827, they moved from Islington to Robert Street off the Strand, just around the corner from the Royal Society of Arts. And then he began upping his literary output. So in 1827, for example, he wrote Plea of the Midsummer Fairies, Hero and Leander, Lycus the Centaur, and other poems. I shan't dwell on them, but do note the titles and go away and read them. The Plea of the Midsummer Fairies is a particularly interesting one. Lycus the Centaur got great praise. Sadly, 1827 also sees the birth and immediate death in birth of his first child, a daughter. And again, in a very, very short verse, he sums up his feelings. Little eyes that scarce did see, little lips that never smiled. Alas, my little dear dead child, death is thy father and not me. I but embraced thee soon as he. So again, he sadly, although he has fun with wordplay, he is also touched by tragedy within his life, but his output continues. 1829, a play, Mr. Sims, which sadly no longer extant, performed at the Surrey Theatre. 1831, a comic annual. 1832, a second comic annual dedicated to King William IV, as a result of which he visits the king at Brighton. Others of his works are dedicated to other great figures. His novel, his sole novel in 3 volumes, or a literary volley, as he calls it, play on tennis and volumes themselves, was dedicated to the Duke of Devonshire. So he is a well-connected man in terms of how his work is received. Tilney Hall, a bit too long to go into the whole plot, but again, there is this kind of tragic element to it. One of the main characters in it is a Cockney merchant by the name of Twig, who retires to the country in order to become a gentleman farmer. And so one of the things he does is to have a fête champêtre where he decides to invite all of his neighbours to join him. Although unfortunately he's not much of a farmer and the animals escape and cause complete chaos. So it's that again, that whole thing about people, circumstances not turning out as you would wish them to, people not being happy in the circumstances necessarily in which they know themselves. So he's not doing too badly. Unfortunately, by 1834, just as he's becoming well known, he is threatened with bankruptcy. And so he does what many people of the time did, which is to leave for Koblenz and then Ostend for reasons of health. But by 1838, he was re-establishing himself, publishing the monthly Hood's Own, with again comic pieces. Then in 1840, when the credit situation, the financial situation is a little stabilized, he returns to England. He becomes involved in the new monthly magazine, which has the advantage not only of a £300 annual salary, thereby providing some stability, but he also gets paid for writing the articles. So his position stabilizes to the extent where he moves to St. John's Wood, and as Massey writes, had his cosy parties of literary friends and was better than he had been for many years. Of course, one of the disadvantages of having so many friends is they come and they're supposed to come for a few days and they end up staying and he has to feed them and therefore his money is eaten into. But in 1844, a new leaf, Hood's Monthly Magazine and Comic Miscellany, another series of poems. And now that we're talking about the comic, I think it's, having provided a bit of a biographical sketch up until now, it's time to look at some of those poems. Hood was interested in all kinds of poetical forms, including blank verse. And on one occasion, he wrote to the editor of Punch, referring to blank verse, this literary land which has until recently been terra incognita. And therefore he proposed a nocturnal ballad, a nocturnal sketch. Even is come, and from the dark park, hark, the signal of the setting sun, one gun, and 6 is sounding from the chime, prime time to go and see the Drury Lane Dane slain, or hear Othello's jealous doubt spout out, or Macbeth raving at that shade-made blade, denying to his frantic clutch much touch. Or else to see you crow with wide stride ride 4 horses as no other man can span, or in the small Olympic pit sit split laughing at Liston while you quiz his phiz. Anon night comes, and with her wings brings things such as with his poetic tongue, young sun. The gas up blazes with its bright white light, and paralytic watchmen prowl, growl, howl about the streets, and take up Pall Mall Sal, who hasting to her nightly jobs, robs fobs. Now thieves to enter for your cash, smash, crash, past drowsy Charlie in a deep street, sleep creep, but frightened by policemen B3 flee, and while they're going whisper low, no go. Now puss, while folks are in their beds treads leads, and sleepers waking grumble, drat that cat, who in the muck gutter caterwauls, squalls, mauls some feline foe, and screams in shrill ill will. Now bulls of Basham of a prize-sized rise in childish dreams, and with a roar gore poor Georgie, or Charlie, or Billy, willy-nilly. But nursemaid, in a nightmare rest, chest pressed, dreameth of one of her old flames, James Games, and that she hears, what faith is man's, Anne's bands, and his, from Reverend Mr. Rice, twice, thrice. White ribbons flourish, and a stout shout out that upward goes. Shows Rose knows those bows woes. So you are carried along by it, but the ability to produce something which is ironic and mocking in blank verse, something we normally ascribe to Shakespeare, being used here in a much more amusing and summative way as well. He's saying, you know, this is a typical evening. And he takes you right across from the simple launching of the gun or the sounding of the gun to show you a second, take you through people who are sort of dealing with streetwalkers and children having nightmares and cats keeping people awake. It's just a wonderful picture, a little pen portrait of London, but all in blank verse. Not sure that anybody else has ever attempted such a thing, to my mind, with success. Another poem of his was, of course, the one that got me hooked on Hood in the first place, Mary's Ghost. Mary's Ghost, a pathetic ballad. 'Twas in the middle of the night, to sleep young William tried, when Mary's ghost came stealing in and stood at his bedside. Oh, William dear, my rest eternal ceases. Alas, my everlasting peace is broken into pieces. I thought the last of all my cares would end with my last minute. But though I went to my long home, I didn't stay long in it. The body snatchers, they have come and made a snatch at me. It's very bad them kind of men won't let a body be. You thought that I was buried deep, quite decent-like and chary. But from her grave in Marybone, they've come and boned your Mary. The arm that used to take your arm is took to Dr. Vyse, and both my legs are gone to walk the hospital at Guy's. I vowed that you should have my hand, but fate gives us denial. You'll find it there at Dr. Bell's in spirits and a file. As for my feet, the little feet you used to call so pretty, there's one I know in Bedford Row and t'others in the city. I can't tell where my head is gone, but Dr. Carp you can. As for my trunk, it's all packed up to go by Pickford's van. I wish you'd go to Mr. P and save me such a ride. I don't half like the outside place they took for my inside. The cock-it crows. I must be gone. My William, we must part. But I'll be yours in death, although Sir Astley has my heart. Don't go to weep upon my grave and think that there I be. They haven't left an atom there of my anatomy. And again, you see that wonderful play on words, the very clear description of how, in absent proper medical models, bodies are robbed and their parts distributed for various things. This song, as we can see from the illustration on the right, was actually turned into a song. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. But which almost turns it in, takes it beyond the commentary that it has here and makes it slightly comic, even though it's tragic. But what I think is the brilliance of this poem. You imagine you're a 9-year-old and you're reading about body snatching, but it's done in such a wonderfully delicate way. Visiting the partner and realizing exactly what has happened. I wish to emphasize in the next poem that whilst dismemberment is also a part of the next poem, I do not have a particularly ghoulish interest in this particular area. But again, it's another one of these things. And again, it perhaps it's linked to this. Hood's health was not good. And so therefore that may well have influenced the subject areas of his poetry. And this is, of course, the other one which is mentioned in the blurb for this talk, namely Faithless Nelly Gray, a pathetic ballad. They're always pathetic ballads in the nice sense of invoking pathos. Ben Battle was a soldier bold and used to war's alarms, but a cannonball took off his legs, so he lay down his arms. Now, as they bore him off the field, said he, let others shoot, for here I leave my second leg and the 42nd foot. The army surgeons made him limbs, said he, they're only pegs, but they're as wooden members quite as represent my legs. Now, Ben, he loved a pretty maid. Her name was Nelly Gray, so he went to pay her his devours when he devoured his pay. But when he called on Nelly Gray, she made him quite a scoff. When she saw his wooden legs, began to take them off. Oh, Nelly Gray, is this your love so warm? The love that loves a scarlet coat should be more uniform. Said she, I loved a soldier once, for he was blithe and brave, but I will never have a man with both legs in the grave. Before you had those timber toes, your love I did allow, but then, you know, you stand upon another footing now. Oh, Nelly Gray, for all your jeering speeches, at duty's call I left my legs in Badajoz's breeches. Peninsular War. Why then, said she, you've lost the feet of legs in war's alarms, and now you cannot wear your shoes upon your feats of arms. Oh, false and fickle Nelly Gray, I know why you refuse. Although I've no feet, some other man is standing in my shoes. I wish I'd never seen your face, but now a fond farewell, for you will be my death, alas, you will not be my knell. Now when he went from Nelly Gray, his heart so heavy got, and life was such a burthen grown, it made him take a knot. So round his melancholy neck a rope he did entwine, and for the second time in life enlisted in the line. One end he tied around a beam, and then removed his pegs, as his legs were off, of course, he soon was off his legs. And there he hung, till he was dead as any nail in town, for though distress had cut him up, it could not cut him down. A dozen men sat on his corpse to find out why he tried, and they buried Ben in 4 crossroads with a stake in his inside. And you can see here in the image, this is a later edition of the poem with a depiction of this scene of him and Nelly and his legs being taken off. So again, quite, on one level, very amusing, wonderful wordplay, but again, slightly macabre and sinister as we realize what is happening towards the end. One last verse in comic vein. Miss Kilmansegg and her precious leg. Subtitled A Golden Legend, or as we perhaps shall learn later, a golden leg end. This is the story of a rich young girl who meets with an accident and has to deal with the accident's consequences. As you can see by this representation, it is a poem of over 300 verses. I do not intend to take you through every single one of them, but have instead chosen certain highlights to illustrate, again, Hood's mastery in poetry. The early part of the film, the early part of the, it's like a film, the way it tells the story. The early part of the poem refers to her birth and her christening. So we'll start on verse 14. Into this world we come like ships, launched from the docks and stocks and slips for fortune, fair or fatal. And one little craft is cast away in its very first trip in Barbican Bay, while another rides safe at Port Natal. What different lots our stars accord, this babe to be hailed and wooed as a lord, and that to be shunned by a leper. One to the world's wine, honey, and corn, another like Colchester native born to its vinegar only and pepper. One is littered under a roof, neither wind nor waterproof, that's the prose of love in a cottage, a puny, naked, shivering wretch, the whole of whose birthright would not fetch, though Robbins himself drew up the sketch, the bid of a mess of pottage. So you can see this, contrasting, thinking of all things bright and beautiful, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high or lowly and governs their estate. Continuing. The other sex, the tender, the fair, what ride reverses of fate are there, whilst Margaret, charmed by the bulbul rare in a garden of gall, reposes, poor Peggy hawks nosegays from street to street, till, think of that who find life so sweet, she hates the smell of roses. Not so with the infant Kilmansegg. She was not born to steal or beg or gather cresses in ditches, to plait the straw or bind the shoe, or sit all day to hem and sew, as females must, and not a few, to fill their insides with stitches. She was not doomed for bread to eat, to be put to her hands as well as her feet, to carry home linen from mangles, or heavy-hearted and weary-limbed, to dance on rope in a jacket trimmed with as many blows as spangles. She was one of those whose by fortune's boon are born, as they say, with a silver spoon in her mouth, not a wooden ladle. To speak according to poets' wont, Plutus as sponsor stood at her font, and Midas rocked the cradle. At her first debut, she found her head on a pillow of down in a downy bed with a damask canopy over. For although by the vulgar popular saw all mothers are said to be in the straw, some children are born in clover. Her very first draught of vital air, it was not the common chameleon fare of plebeian lungs and noses. Oh no, her earliest sniff of this world was a whiff of the genuine Otto of roses. We, because of time and because you would be completely brain dead if I were to go through every single verse, we leap through her christening to her education. Instead of stories from Edgeworth's page, the true golden law for our golden age, or lessons from Barbald and Trimmer, teaching the worth of virtue and health. All that she knew was the virtue of wealth, provided by vulgar nursery stealth with a book of leaf gold for a primer. The very metal of merit, they told, and praised her for being as good as gold till she grew as a peacock haughty. Of money they talked the whole day round, and weighed dessert like grapes by the pound, till she had an idea from the very sound that people with naught were naughty. So you can see how this young lady is being set up in a lap of luxury. And moving on 100 verses or so, she goes riding. Her horse bolts. She has an accident. The cause is serious. The outcome is serious. For the king's physician who nursed the case, his verdict gave with an awful face, and 3 others concerned to egg it, that to give the patient to give old death the slip, like the Pope, instead of a personal trip, must send her leg as a legate. The limb was doomed. It couldn't be saved. And like other people, the patient behaved, nay, bravely that cruel parting braved, which makes some persons so falter. They would rather part without a groan, with the flesh of their flesh and the bone of their bone they obtained at St. George's altar. But when it came to fitting the stump with a proxy limb, then flatly and plump she spoke in the spirit olden. She couldn't, she shouldn't, she wouldn't have wood, nor a leg of cork if she ever stood, and she swore an oath, or something as good, the proxy limb should be golden. A wooden leg? What a sort of peg for your common jockeys and jennies? No, no, her mother might worry and plague. We'd go down on her knees and beg, but nothing would move Miss Kilmansegg. She would have a golden leg if it cost 10,000 guineas. Gold, 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 oh, let it be gold, asleep or awake, that tale she told. And when she grew delirious, till her parents resolved to grant her wish, if they melted down plate and goblet and dish. The case was getting so serious. So, a leg was made in a comely mould of gold, fine virgin glittering gold, as solid as man could make it. Solid in foot and calf and shank, a prodigious sum of money it sank. In fact, 'twas a branch of the family bank, and no easy matter to break it. All sterling metal, not half and half. That goldsmith's mark was stamped on the calf, 'twas pure as from Mexican barter. And to make it more costly, just over the knee, where another ligature used to be, was a circle of jewels worth shillings to see, a newfangled badge of the garter. 'Twas a splendid, brilliant, beautiful leg, fit for the court of Scanderbeg, that precious leg of Miss Kilmansegg. For thanks to parental bounty, secure from mortification's touch, she stood on a member that cost as much as a member for all the county. So you see, while Hood is mocking the whole issue of her obsession with money, he's also mocking issues around rotten boroughs, purchase of votes, and the like. But this young girl, who by her very upbringing believes that gold and money are really important, I shall skip the section of the party where her leg goes on display, save to share with you that one of the verses was, "But where, oh where, with one accord, cried Moses and Mufti Jack and my lord, Wang Fong and Il Bondakani, when suddenly there came a thump, thump, clump, clump, thump, like the spectre in Don Giovanni. So she turns up and is obviously famous for her leg, and is eventually wooed and won by an evil foreign count who, being a bit of a gambler, manages to work his way through her money in 15 or 20 verses or so, but is still in debt, and she is unable to help him. But he then realizes how he can resolve the issue, because there is still something which is available to him. And so he makes his plot. For at night, the independent Miss Kilmansegg took off her independent leg and slept with it beneath her pillow. They have an argument. She goes to bed. As she went with her taper up the stairs, how little her swollen eye was aware that the shadow which followed was double. Or when she closed her chamber door, it was shutting out, and for evermore, the world and its worldly trouble. Little she dreamt, as she laid aside her jewels, after one glance of pride, they were solemn requests to vanity, or when her robe she began to doff, that she stood so near to the putting off of the flesh that clothes humanity. And when she quenched her taper's light, how little she thought, as the smoke took flight, that her day was done, and merged in a night of dreams and duration uncertain. Or along with her own, that a hand of bone was closing mortality's curtain. But vainly, vainly the thunder fell, for the soul of the sleeper was under a spell the time had late embittered. The count, as once at her foot he knelt, that foot which he now wanted to melt. But hush, was a stir at her pillow she felt, and some object before her glittered. 'Twas the golden leg, she knew its gleam, and up she started and tried to scream, but e'en in the moment she started, down came the limb with a frightful smash, and lost in the universal flash that her eyeballs made at so mortal a clash, the spark called vital departed. Gold, still gold, hard, yellow and cold, for gold she lived, and she died for gold, by a golden weapon, not oaken. In the morning they found her, all alone, stiff and bloody, and cold as stone, but her leg, the golden leg, was gone, and the golden bowl was broken. Gold, still gold, it haunted her yet. At the Golden Lion the inquest met, its foreman a carver and gilder, and the jury debated from 12 till 3 at what the verdict ought to be, and they brought it in as felo de se, because her own leg had killed her. And this is the moral of the story. Gold, 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 bright and yellow, hard and cold, molten, graven, hammered and rolled, heavy to get and light to hold, hoarded, bartered, bought and sold, stolen, borrowed, squandered, doled, spurned by the young, but hugged by the old, to the very verge of the churchyard mould, price of many a crime untold. Gold, 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 good or bad 1,000-fold, how widely its agencies vary. To save, to ruin, to curse, to bless, as even its minted coins express, now stamped with the image of good Queen Bess, and now of a Bloody Mary. So the moral of the story is, do not give yourself to gold or the golden calf. And what is interesting about this poem is it marks, to my mind, it marks a very interesting point, because he is not only, it is fun, it is humorous, but there is that underlying social critique of the blindness of those with unlimited wealth to what goes on around them and how dangerous it can be. And it's on that particular note of commentary that I'd like to move into the last part of my talk with two poems, which mark Hood's passage into a more biting and savage social commentary, but again done with skill and elegance and grace and rhyme. The first poem we shall see is based on the story of a woman who was a seamstress. She used to sew trousers and shirts using materials supplied by her employer, and that required a £2 deposit. In order to be able both to pay that and, more importantly, to be able to feed her children, she pawned the clothing she made, was unable to keep up the debt, and ended up in the workhouse. As a result, her name was Mrs. Biddle. The story was reported in the Times, and as a result of it, Hood wrote a poem called The Song of the Shirt, of which you may have heard, and part of which I shall read. Again, it's a long poem. So this is in 1843, published in Punch. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the song of the shirt. Work, 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 till the brain begins to swim. Work, 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 till the eyes are heavy and dim. Seam and gusset and band, band and gusset and seam, till over the buttons I fall asleep and sew them on in a dream. O men with sisters dear, O men with mothers and wives, it is not linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt, sewing at once with a double thread, a shroud as well as a shirt. But why do I talk of death, that phantom of grisly bone? I hardly fear its terrible shape. It seems so like my own. It seems so like my own because of the fasts I keep. O God, that bread should be so dear and flesh and blood so cheap. Work, 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 my labour never flags. And what are its wages? A bed of straw, a crust of bread, and rags. That shattered roof, this naked floor, a table, a broken chair, and a wall so blank, my shadow I thank for sometimes falling there. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch, would that its tone could reach the rich, she sang the song of the shirt. This poem was very well received. It was translated into a number of foreign languages. It was set to music. Pieces of music were written inspired by it. And such was its impact that on Hood's tombstone, it actually says, he sang the song of the shirt. This was, if you think about it, we're looking at a period 1843. We're looking, it's around the time that Dickens is also writing about social issues and the poverty of people and the complete disparities that there are between the rich and the poor, of the nature that we've seen dealt with amusingly in Kilmansegg, but which here he turns to more serious tone. And then the other poem, provoked by, inspired by circumstance, yet another young woman, possibly with child, ends her life by throwing herself into the Thames. Bridge of Sighs. This is an illustration by Gustave Doré of that poem. Again, it's quite a long one, so I shall only read a few of the verses. One more unfortunate, weary of breath, rashly importunate, gone to her death. Take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Look at her garments clinging like cerements, whilst the wave constantly drips from her clothing. Take her up instantly, loving, not loathing. Touch her not scornfully, think of her mournfully, gently and humanly, not of the stains of her. All that remains of her now is pure womanly. Who was her father? Who was her mother? Had she a sister? Had she a brother? Or was there a dearer one still and a nearer one yet than all other? Alas, for the rarity of Christian charity under the sun. Oh, it was pitiful, near a whole city full, home she had none. Where the lamps quiver so far in the river, with many a light from window and casement, from garret to basement, she stood with amazement, houseless by night. The bleak wind of March made her tremble and shiver, but not the dark arch or the black flowing river. Mad from life's history, glad to death's mystery, swift to be hurled anywhere, anywhere out of this world. Take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Perishing gloomily, spurred by contumely, cold in humanity, burning insanity into her rest. Cross her hands humbly, as if praying dumbly over her breast, owing her weakness, her evil behavior, and leaving with meekness her sins to her Saviour. Again, a powerful poem pointing out a social issue, and both the poem, the painting you saw at the beginning of this and this painting by G.F. Watts, inspired by that poem and the incident which provokes it. So we see that Hood is not just a poet, not just a social commentator, but what he says ripples out from what he produces. But we are approaching, since we're talking so much about death, the end of this talk, and therefore it behoves us in doing so to talk about the man himself and his final years very briefly. He launched Hood's magazine in 1844. Unfortunately, the financing failed. His health continued to decline. On one occasion, a friend was applying a mustard poultice to his body to help draw out impurities, and he simply looked and smiled and said, "Oh, so little meat for so much mustard." So even in his own personal pain and agony, he was able to be humorous. Indeed, as he said, he has been so often at death's door, he could almost fancy he heard the creaking of the hinges. So he was not unaware of his own position, but was never maudlin about it. It was always something, again, using his humor about the situation. His financial position, though, is not particularly good, and so an approach was made to the government, and Sir Robert Peel proposed and agreed to a £100 annual pension, so that in his final declining years, he did have some money and some financial stability. It was not the 300 that he used to have from his literary endeavors, but at least it was some kind of stability. He died on the 3rd of May, 1845. Just before that, he wrote this interesting little poem, which I think again shows that the duality that he has in all circumstances. Farewell, life, my senses swim, and the world is growing dim. Thronging shadows cloud the night, the light like the advent of the night, colder, colder, colder still, upward steals a vapor chill, strong the earthly odor grows, I smell the mold among the rose. Yet he's not always negative. Welcome life, the spirit strives, strength returns and hope revives, cloudy fears and shapes forlorn fly like shadows at the morn, o'er the earth there comes a bloom, sunny light for sullen gloom, warm perfume for vapor cold, I smell the rose above the mold. Sadly, however, the mold did triumph over the rose, and when he died, after his death, he was interred in Kensal Green Cemetery in London. I don't know if you've ever been to Kensal Green Cemetery, if you've ever, it's a fascinating, one of those great Victorian cemeteries where people from all walks of life are buried with particular tombs. And this was a contemporary illustration of the tomb of Thomas Hood, as you can see, quite large, with a bust of the man, with bronze vignettes on the side, and then the mask of poetry and the poet's lyre. This is a photograph from a mid-19th century book, as you can see, in memory of Thomas Hood, and it does say at the top, if you can just see it, he sang the Song of the Shirt. And so you see this beautiful tomb of Thomas Hood. As we know, unfortunately, Victorian cemeteries suffer neglect and vandalism. And if you go to Kensal Green Cemetery nowadays, that is what you will see. So there you have it, a quick canter through the life, death, and selected poetry of a poet, a comic, and a commentator. I think Thomas Hood's great gift is his ability to use words and different forms of verse, both to amuse us, but also to remind us that not everything in the garden is rosy. And his understanding of that is beautifully summed up in the poem with which I would like to conclude, with which you may well be familiar. I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. He never came a wink too soon, nor brought too long a day. But now I often wish the night had borne my breath away. I remember where I was used to swing, and thought the air must rush as fresh to swallows on the wing. My spirit flew in feathers then, that is so heavy now, and summer pools could hardly cool the fever on my brow. I remember the roses red and white, the violets and the lily cups, those flowers made of light, the lilacs where the robin built, and where my brother settler Burnham on his birthday. The tree is living yet. I remember the fir trees dark and high. I used to think their tender tops were close against the sky. It was a childish innocence, but now 'tis little joy to know I'm farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Okay, because we're on hybrid, you can speak into this.
Yeah, it's just, thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. You said very early on in his life he was an engraver.
Yes.
So I was just curious to know if any of the engravings that you've chosen in the talk are by him, or are they, was he an artist engraver or an engraver for publishing?
He did do some of his own works, which featured in some of the comic annuals. I didn't put any of them in because they would have interrupted essentially what I came across a poem only this afternoon actually about gin and the dangers of gin, where the end of the bottom of the poem there is a little drawing that he has done of a drop of gin, and you see all of the ills of society swimming around in the drop. So he did do some of his own engravings to illustrate his work later in life, but the original engraving was more connected with work for other publishers.
Any other questions?
The question from Betty, I think.
Was he religious at all?
I don't know. I get the impression he must have been, because he was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery, and therefore one would imagine that his faith was important to him. He clearly is very exercised by the issue of death. But there isn't a particular religious theme that can be traced through his poetry. No. And in fact, if you look at Miss Kilmansegg, it's the wages of sin is death, and gold and excess and God and mammon and so on feature, but it's more, I think his interest is more in using those situations to address social issues rather than having a Christian bent to them.
This is a comment which you might know of. I saw that picture of the drowned woman at the Watts Gallery.
Yes.
And they were making the point that Watts was not very conscious of how much money he could make, because nobody would want to buy that. And so the fact that he'd chosen to paint it was a tribute to this whole interest in helping the unemployed and the poor.
Yes, and that's right. But as we've seen, both with the both with that painting and then with the music and so on that's inspired, and the copies that are inspired by the poetry. What Hood does resonates in wider circles and in wider society, and that's what I think gives him and his poetry such power. Before we take the next question in the room, we've had a question from Geraldine, which was his lack of formal education held against him? I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's quite clear that he's as great a wordsmith as any of those who went to public school and university. You know, I think he's as good as, and you look at some of his other verse, I think he's as good as Byron. In fact, I should be giving a paper in Pisa precisely on his mockery of Byron, or his elusive mockery of Byron, taking one of Byron's poems and looking at one of Hood's on the same Orientalist theme. So I don't think it was held against him in terms of his ability to publish his work. He seems to have managed to do that quite well, even if it was what we nowadays might call self-publishing, as he set up the magazines and got the sponsorship for the magazines. But I don't think so. And I think when you look more closely at some of his pieces, some of the smaller pieces, it goes up very well against some of the greater poets. But as Sarah Lodge says, you know, the fact that you can't put him in a box makes him difficult to fold into a literary studies program, I think, which I think is a great pity.
Oh,
I've got a question.
got another question.
I've seen one from Duncan as well, but we'll take the one in the room first, and then.
And I have one as well.
Well, what we'll do, if it's okay, we'll take Jane, and then we'll take Duncan, and then we'll take Dipali's question, and then it's sort of in and out.
Bravo, Steve. But what would you say to the proposition that you can put him in a box, that you can put him alongside Charles Lamb, and you can put him alongside Edward Lear, and that you can place him alongside Charles Dickens, you know, all writers who perform with a very audible social conscience? And kind of on that, I was thinking about why I don't like I Remember, even though I think Hood, you know, is kind of irresistible. So just to play devil's advocate, I was thinking, you know, I don't like it because I think it's mawkish. And I think Dickens, you know, at his worst is mawkish as well.
And I'm just thinking, have a heart of stone to read The Death of Little Nell without laughing.
Yeah, okay, sure, yeah. So anyway, there is a question there. And it's, well, first of all, I think you can place him. And secondly, within a literary frame, I mean. And secondly, I wanted to ask about the relationship of his social conscience, which I think does come through the poetry, and his life. I mean, was he in any way a philanthropist? What actually did he do? Did he do anything out there in the world, so to speak, to alleviate the distress of others? You know, I mean, of course, his writing made very very plain that the world was not rosy, as you said. Mm-hmm. But just wondered a little bit. Could you say a little bit more about his politics?
Okay. Well, I'll start with that, and then I'll go back to the boxability of him. In the first instance, because he didn't have a lot of money himself, it was difficult for him to exercise any particular form of philanthropy. And so therefore his attempt at social commentary came through his poetry. So I think that's how he tried to stir the public conscience. And as we have seen with the various works of art produced, and there was a slight ripple, but no questions were asked in the House as a result of what he had said. So he didn't have the money to be particularly philanthropic, but he did, where possible, use his poetry to draw attention to certain issues, whilst also, for the greater part, being much more ironic about life in general than other things. No, I was essentially the non-boxability. You're quite right. Yes, Dickens does similar kinds of things, but Hood is not a part of that canon, if you like. That's the point, which is the point that Sarah Lodge makes. Because he does these various things, you know, you can talk about Dickens's work in a particular way. You can talk about other writers' work in a particular way, and I don't think you can fit Hood that easily. Yes, there are similarities and so on. I mean, he was of the Cockney school, but nobody really refers to him. And, you know, he was a Cockney, but Does he feature in discussions when the Cockney School is being discussed in universities? Not particularly, because they, you know, they. Okay, we'll talk about it offline. There was a question from Duncan. Did Hood influence Belloc? That I'm afraid I don't know, but it's what you say and what Jane says are some interesting points for consideration. But Dipali, you had a question, I think.
Yes, but I was wondering if there were any others from the audience. No? Yeah, I've got some questions and some observations as well, because the theme that seems to have come across in all his poems is the loss of the lower limbs. And I'm wondering what the significance of that is, and whether that's a sort of an analogy of something. When you lose your limbs, that leaves you sort of, you know, unable to walk, unable to have a position in life. And I'm just wondering whether, you know, he was an entrepreneur as well, as was evident in, you know, all the things that he did, that he brought out, you know, the books and everything else. I'm just wondering whether he was trying to portray through the medium of his analogies, you know, what life was like. I mean, on the one hand, there was this golden limb which went missing, and the golden. Yes. So, yeah, the limbs and the gold, I think that's a very interesting analogy that he seemed to be working on.
You have pointed out a coincidence in the two poems that I have chosen that until now had not occurred to me. But when I look back through, if I think of other poems by Hood, I'm not sure there is such a fixation, although Mary's legs as well have gone to walk the guys. So the three poems all have some kind of dismemberment or lacking limbs in them.
Limbs in particular.
At the risk of making an awful pun, if I tried to answer that question because I only looked at these poems, I don't think I'd have a leg to stand on.
You're definitely a Hood man.
I am, yes. I hope you don't feel hoodwinked by what I've been saying all evening.
The other thing I was going to point out is that, you know, the talk is actually about someone who was very brilliant and, well, not terribly prolific, but not remembered by name. And I think I can see why, because he lived in an era when commercialism was at its height, you know. I mean, the gold was being worshipped, you know, the golden limb was being worshipped. And he was actually drawing, you know, attention to the fact that there was a bit too much of that happening, and that didn't win favor with the people there at the time. And although Dickens did a similar thing through all his, you know, novels where he portrayed how the poor were living, he did it in a different way, whereas Hood cut to the chase quite strongly with his humor, because humor can do that. And I suspect that could well be why he's not remembered by name so much.
Possibly, and of course Dickens, many of Dickens's novels appeared first of all in serial form because he needed to make the money. Hood's comic annuals and monthly magazines were part of that whole
commentary
plethora of monthly magazines and publications, some more serious. This
social commentary.
Well, no, just sort of, you know, the equivalent of our news magazines today, also commenting on events and fashion and society. So there was a regular market for these kinds of things, but I don't think, we go back to the boxability, I don't think Hood quite cut through in the same way as some of the others did.
Oh, some more questions. Who you first?
I wondered if he was a bit.
Can you hear?
I wondered if he was a bit put on the fringe because there were other poets who were romantics, and he was not in that caliber, was he? I wondered if
he was. No. I mean, I think he was partly on the fringe because of the circumstance and the way in which the literary field was developing at that time. You talk about the romantics. I mean, you could at a push argue that he is also a romantic poet in that he writes during that period and touches on those issues of emotion and so on, which we find present. But again, we come back to the boxability and the fact that that's why he doesn't fit into a university syllabus, for example, in the same way that some might.
Next question.
Was he a club performer? Was he good company, or did his slightly melancholic tone at times become a bit wearing? But he must have had significant supporters and admirers to have caught the attention of Sir Robert Peel.
Indeed, and yes, he was quite sociable when he had the money. He was sociable. There are stories of dinners, dining with the Lambs and various other literary figures. And as I said, when he moved to a larger house, slightly out of the centre of London, he would, people would come and stay supposedly for the weekend, but would end up staying for longer and thereby eating into his finances. So it was quite clear that he was, though not to my knowledge, a member of a club. I'll start again. Though not himself a member of a club, I think he meets that issue of clubability, having a good circle of friends. So
He seems to be fitting into the social environment as well, although he didn't come from a very rich family as such. But he seems to fit in, with the socializing and all that.
I think he was, when you read the descriptions of him as that one I did, he comes across as quite quiet, but I'm quite sure that the conversation over the dinner table would have been fascinating.
Oh, another question.
You did mention a brief reference to songs.
Yes.
And it made me think, have you come across any published music for the?
Oh, yes, there are versions. The illustration I showed you of Mary's Ghost is actually the front cover to the sheet music for
and who was the composer?
Oh, I can scroll back through and find the name. I can't tell you immediately off the top of my head. But yes, no, certainly. Yes.
Because they are quite rhythmical and musical.
Yes. Yeah. Any more questions? No,
Well, I've got a question.
When I was growing up.
Sorry, there's a question from Duncan, I think.
Yeah, I'm just, again, on this question really of whether it's more likely that he was influencing other poets, because you do get the feel of him, not only in comic verse, such as Belloc's, but you also get his feel in the late verse of Thomas Hardy. You know how Hardy tends to chime his vowels in quite a remarkably evocative way. I have a feeling that he's a poet's poet. What do you think?
I think that might be a very good description of him. I think the interesting thing is that he riffs on so much that, whether it's a description of an artist or a performer or a small observation. There's a wonderful poem which is begins each verse begins saying something wonderful about his infant son, but by the end of it, the poem actually finishes, I cannot rest my love until he's sent above, not to heaven but up to bed, because the child is, he's talking about him as this beautiful child, and then the child does something like putting peas up his nose or whatever it might be. So he covers a wide range of things. I think.
Thanks.
Any more? No, I tend to get that impression that he was quite multifaceted, and although his strength was puns and wordplay, but he also, brought to the attention of his readers the social situation. And also, I was struck when I was at school, I read this poem, and it made no sense to me because I was in India when I read this. It's called November. No sun, no moon, no morn, no noon, no dusk, no dawn, no proper time of day, no sky, no earthly view. and then he ends off November. But living in this country, I discovered that it's been like that all of 2024. We've only just begun to see some sun. But before I thank Steve, I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that Thomas Hood also has a sort of a roundabout way, a connection to my part of the world because of his contribution to this magazine called The Athenaeum, which was actually founded by a gentleman
just hold
called...
this up for the benefit of those on screen.
Yeah, it was founded by a gentleman called James Silk Buckingham in 1828. He actually was living in India at the time, the country of my birth. And he also published, he also started a magazine called the Calcutta Journal. But then he had to leave India because of his subtle criticism of the East India Company. So then he came back to live in England. And that also has a sort of a distant connection with Bath, because in Bath you had a lot of people from the East India Company who were present in Bath in the early 19th century. And, you know, they brought a lot of ideas from India to this country. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you for the joy that you gave us from connecting with this wonderful, well, I wouldn't call him prolific, but rather interesting individual who contributed so much, you know, through his wordplay to our enjoyment. And I'm very glad that you've brought him to our notice now. So I'd like to thank you very much, Steve. And also, they're not here, but I'd like to thank everyone from the institution who made this evening possible. So thank you, Steve.